Hello, my name is David Fideler. I'm the editor of the Living Ideas Journal website and also the editor of the Stoic Insights website. I write about how classical and Renaissance ideas can contribute to today's world, and it's my great pleasure to be speaking with Dr. John Sellars, who has very similar interests. John is the author of many books on ancient philosophy, and I'll provide links to his books below this video. John Sellars teaches at Royal Holloway University in London. He's a recognized expert on Stoicism, and he's currently writing a book on Renaissance philosophy. So, John, it's really great to be speaking with you again.
Yes, good to see you, David.
Yes. Well, it's really fascinating how we are kindred spirits since we both have a deep interest in ancient philosophy and the Renaissance. And I know also that you have a wonderful collection of early books printed during the Renaissance, which I would love to see someday. But for now, I'm wondering if you could explain to us how you actually became interested in the Renaissance and Renaissance humanism, because I've never heard you discuss this, and I'm sure everyone would love to know about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question and perhaps quite a convoluted story. When I was very young, for whatever reason, I was very interested in architecture, and the idea that the built environment that surrounds us, has a significant impact on how we live, right? And it's a kind of a direct and immediate sort of connection with art history, right? Even if someone never even goes into an art gallery, they're surrounded by buildings and they're engaging with the art of architecture, throughout their daily lives. So I was fascinated by architecture when I was younger, and briefly considered architecture as a career, but decided not to pursue that. One of the reasons why I didn't pursue it is I guess I was more interested in the history of architecture than with modern architecture and the history of classical architecture. And so with those interests, the Renaissance kind of became something I became very interested in at quite a young age, as this attempt to revive and literally rebuild the ancient world. So in terms of the world of Renaissance humanists, I suppose one of the first humanists that I sort of became familiar with was Alberti, simply because he'd written on architecture. So I was familiar with the Renaissance in that sense quite early on. Much later, after I had decided to study philosophy and had become interested in ancient philosophy in particular, and the Stoics, as you know, one of the things that I was most interested in was the reception of Stoicism after antiquity, right? So yes. I hadn't started off as a classical scholar, right? I'd started off as someone studying philosophy, interested in a whole series of thinkers from throughout the history of the subject. And it was really by studying a number of later thinkers, people like Spinoza, for instance, or Nietzsche, or various other characters, all of whom seem to have some passing connection or similarity with ancient Stoic ideas. So there's a sense in which I was always as interested in the idea of a tradition of Stoic thought running through the history of philosophy as I was with the ancient philosophers themselves. And so, again, that prompted me to look at various Renaissance thinkers and how they were reviving and engaging with these ancient Stoic ideas. So those are two sort of very different ways in which the Renaissance was something that was always on my radar.
Yes, well, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm a huge Alberti fan as well. And I was introduced to classical architecture when I was in college. I had a friend who was a classical architect. And it's also an extension of the Pythagorean tradition, and you find aesthetic thought in Alberti. So it's very, very rich. When I was growing up, my father owned a book publishing company, and on my mother's side of the family, they had a printing shop and published a magazine. And so I grew up with ink in my blood, and book publishing actually originated in the Renaissance. So there's that connection with all this minutiae. And I actually owned a publishing company that published translations of ancient Greek philosophical texts. So I think that's one of the connections I had. The other thing is that when I was in my 20s, I studied Platonism and Neoplatonism, for like a decade, really. And through that, I came to study Renaissance Neoplatonism and Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. That was in the later 1400s, but then in the past few years, I've become very, very interested in how the Renaissance actually came into being. So like in the very early 1400s, and then you have all of this civic thought as well. And it's been very exciting to really see exactly how everything fits together and the Renaissance itself emerged. Now, I was very thrilled when I saw the article that you wrote entitled Renaissance Humanism and Philosophy as a Way of Life, which I think is a very important article. And you skillfully dismantled this view of some earlier scholars that the Renaissance humanists were never real philosophers, but just part of a literary movement. And I was wondering if you could explain to us why these earlier scholars were wrong and how they arrived at those conclusions, and what kind of evidence is there to prove that we really do find philosophy in Renaissance humanism?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is a huge subject. I guess, we all have our ideas about what we think philosophy is, right? We all have our own preconceptions,
Yes,
our own prejudices,
yes.
right? And in different periods throughout the 20th century, different ideas might have been in vogue or most prominent that have really sort of shaped the way people approach and read earlier periods in the history of philosophy. So I think we've seen a lot of that going on. And if you think philosophy is some kind of primarily theoretical, systematic project, right? It's about developing a worldview using complex theoretical arguments. Then some people are going to obviously look like good philosophers and others aren't. And I think that view, that kind of image of what philosophy is, has been quite prevalent. And it's led people to highlight some figures as serious philosophers and reject others. So, you can imagine we see the sort of scholastic medieval tradition of philosophy that flourishes immediately before the Renaissance. I mean, that continues right through the Renaissance, right? Particularly in the university settings throughout the 15th and into the 16th centuries. And if you think that kind of, dealing with quite abstract metaphysical questions and logical paradoxes and questions about, language and so on, if you think that's what philosophy is all about, then these scholastic philosophers look like they're really, doing serious philosophy, right? And so there's one view which says that the serious philosophy in the 15th and 16th centuries was really what was going on in the universities. It was the continuation of the medieval tradition. And humanists who were, they were reading some philosophy, but they were also reading history, and they were writing poetry, and they were editing texts. They were doing all sorts of intellectual activities, but they weren't doing the serious logic and metaphysics that the scholastic philosophers were doing. So by comparison, they're not really serious philosophers, right?
Yes. Well, actually, the humanism was a reaction against medieval scholastic philosophy because they found it to be so dry, and they found it to be incredibly lacking when it came to addressing questions that related to human life. So the humanists really wanted to rehumanize philosophy.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting, really key point, because you see, particularly early on, so someone like Petrarch in particular, you see a quite explicit and quite vitriolic rejection of scholasticism. And there's two ways that you can interpret that, right? So one way to interpret it would be to say that what Petrarch is doing is rejecting philosophy as such, right? If you've already decided that scholasticism is what proper philosophy looks like, then when Petrarch attacks it, it looks like he's attacking philosophy, right? He's rejecting philosophy as an activity, and Petrarch, of course, is a very accomplished poet, as well as many other things. So, okay, this is a poet slamming philosophy and saying it's a waste of time. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation, which is obviously the one I'm a bit more sympathetic to, would be to say, well, what Petrarch's doing is not rejecting philosophy as such. He's rejecting one image of philosophy. And what he wants to do is then put in place of that a different idea of what he thinks philosophy is, one that's drawing on different ancient sources to the ones that the scholastic philosophers are.
Yes, because one of his large interests was moral philosophy and character development. And there's that very famous passage where he talks about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which he read probably in a very poor translation, actually. But he said that, yes, you can learn things from Aristotle, but in the Nicomachean Ethics, what he's primarily doing is offering definitions of what the virtues are. And he's not really rousing the reader in any way to actually become a better person. And he said that in order to realize, moral philosophy in that way, we have to turn to the Latin writers like Seneca and Cicero. And he made it quite clear that he wasn't rejecting Aristotle per se, but he was rejecting medieval scholasticism, which he thought had become very narrow and cult-like in its orientation in terms of the way that they worshipped Aristotle as if he was a god who could make no error.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, in terms of thinking about sort of, broadening our sense of what philosophy might be in this period, there's also that thought, not only can you learn important practical lessons about how to live your life by reading people like Seneca and Cicero, key points of reference for him, but also you can learn useful lessons of that sort from reading historians, right? From reading Plutarch's Lives, from reading Tacitus or whoever it might be, that those historical sources can also be useful places to gain philosophical insights.
Exactly. And so what the Renaissance humanists did was they developed actually the original version of the humanities, the Studia Humanitatis, which included grammar, which would have been the study of Latin, and rhetoric, persuasive speaking, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, which sounds rather imposing, but moral philosophy just means character development, and also the idea of creating a better society or a better world. And in my belief, I think that there's an abundance of evidence to show that their main interest really was in moral philosophy, and that everything else was subservient to it in a sense, because they used poetry and history as character developing resources. So, for example, the use of history that the Renaissance humanists made, starting with Petrarch actually, was that by studying history, we would be exposed to exemplary role models who could, offer guidance in terms of, what it is to have a virtuous character.
Yes, I think you're right. Moral philosophy is center stage for a number of the humanists, in the sense that they're interested in these questions about how to live. But there's been some work recently from a number of other sort of scholars sort of highlighting the fact that we also find humanists engaging in natural philosophy and even in logic, kind of offering a humanistic approach to the say Aristotelian texts or other texts that were primarily the sort of purview of scholasticism. So someone like Angelo Poliziano interestingly, gives a series of lectures on Aristotle's logic in Florence in the 15th century. And part of this, again, is a kind of a challenge to the scholastic tradition to say, look, guys, you don't own this. We can study this stuff too, and we're going to have a very different perspective on it because of the sets of preoccupations that we can bring to bear on the text. And we're going to care a lot more about the text. We're going to engage in that philology and make sure that the text is accurate and that we really are reading Aristotle, rather than just relying on a potentially unreliable translation. That so those sorts of developments too are quite interesting in this context.
Yes, and I don't think that the humanists were really against logic per se, but they really emphasized rhetoric because it was important for their political philosophy, because they lived in a republic, Florence. And that's why they felt such a strong connection with Cicero, because he lived in Rome when it was still a republic. And he stressed the fact that rhetoric was important so that you could have a functioning political system. Recently, I came across what I think is a pretty good definition of humanism, and it's from a scholar, Nicholas Mann, and he said that humanism involves, above all, the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts, the restoration of them, and the assimilation of the ideas and values they contain. And I assume that you would agree with that definition, probably.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a fairly good working definition. I mean, it's quite hard to pin down, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, I suppose there are two ways in which you could think about humanism. So one would be in terms of the content, right? So, like that, the definition that you've just suggested about a focus on Greek and Roman texts. Another definition that I've seen that I think is quite interesting is in terms of method rather than content. So one thing the humanists will be interested in is paying attention to the text, doing that philological work,
yes,
making sure the text is correct, and then also trying to interpret it in its historical context.
Yes.
And so treating it as a historical document rather than, say, just a kind of a set of statements or a set of arguments that can be kind of assessed to see whether they're valid or not, regardless of the context in which they were written.
Yes. So that's all part of it. I think that definition is pretty good, but I found the last concluding part of it to be a bit weak, the assimilation of the ideas and values they contain, because when I read the humanist writers, what I see is that they were actually, rather than just assimilating the ideas, one of their primary aims for a lot of the early humanists was that they actually wanted to apply them, not only in their own lives, but in order to transform the world that they were living in, to create a better world. And this is basically an idea that goes back to Petrarch, because he felt that he lived in a time of social collapse, and he basically invented the idea of the Dark Ages, which a long lineage of significant humanists agreed with that idea, actually. And whether or not the Dark Ages actually occurred historically in exactly that kind of way, it's really a belief that was held by all of the humanists. So it was that idea that there had been an incredible cultural decline from Roman times that created this very deep longing for cultural rebirth, which, by definition was the source of the Renaissance. So now you've studied and written about many Renaissance humanists, and I was wondering if you could tell us who your two favorite humanists are and why you find them to be so interesting.
Oh gosh. Okay. I mean, I think I might mention three actually. Which
okay,
is
that's fine.
Cheating, but I mean, I think the first I would have to say would be Petrarch. I think for whatever reasons, he's always been the kind of key point of reference for me in this period. I mean, I've just found him an absolutely fascinating figure, a huge quantity of material that he's written, The invectives are fascinating. His letters are full of all sorts of interesting information, and he's got a great biography as well. So yeah, his life is also a really interesting story to read about. And he's drawing on, in particular, as we mentioned earlier, Seneca and Cicero, key points of reference for my own interests in ancient philosophy. So Petrarch, I think, most definitely would be my favorite. You mentioned earlier that that he has this polemic against the Aristotelians of his day, and I mean, he seems in some places fairly dismissive towards Aristotle, but in part that's because he didn't really know Aristotle himself directly. And so a second humanist who I also find very interesting is Leonardo Bruni.
Oh, yes, yes.
And one of the reasons why I find him very interesting is there's a sense in which he's a corrective to Petrarch. I mean, obviously, he's working a little later. He's had the opportunity to learn Greek. He translates works by both Plato and Aristotle into Latin. And so consequently, he knows Aristotle, right? He's read Aristotle in the Greek and he's translated it. So he has first-hand knowledge of Aristotle's philosophy rather than simply whatever's mediated through the scholastic tradition. And so Bruni has a much more positive, sympathetic outlook towards Aristotle. And I'm a big fan of Aristotle too. So
Yes.
so for those reasons, I'm a big fan of Bruni alongside Petrarch. If I wanted to squeeze a third one in, then I think I'd want to mention Alberti, who we mentioned earlier. I was doing some work on him earlier in the year and sat down and read as many of his works as I could. And again, he's such a rich figure, such a polymath, working in so many different areas. And one of his texts in particular I was reading, entitled, well, in one of the translations, it's entitled "The Use and Abuse of Books,"
Yes.
Which is a hilarious parody of the kind of scholarly life. So he clearly had a really good sense of humor as well.
Absolutely. Yes. I would say that those are my favorite humanists as well. And I'm a huge Alberti fan too. And he was profoundly influenced by Stoicism. If you read his anonymous autobiography, both he and Petrarch did Stoic philosophical exercises. And then his book On the Tranquility of the Soul is titled after a work by Seneca, and it contains hundreds of references to Seneca. I actually believe that it's his version of a textbook of Stoic philosophy. And his book On the Family as well contains a lot of references to Stoicism. So I think if you look at those three texts, it's clear that that was actually his own personal philosophical viewpoint that he followed, but he also added a very interesting dimension to it because there's this sort of like classical contrast between the world of virtue and character and fortune or chance. And Alberti was very heavily into this idea, along with actually Petrarch, that it's only virtue or good character that can overcome fortune. But then Alberti added this other element to it because he disliked idleness. He was really dedicated to work. He was probably a workaholic, actually, as we know. But he felt that work combined with virtue would really overcome, the vagaries of fortune. So that's very interesting because we like all the same humanists. Could you briefly explain how Renaissance humanism is different from secular humanism? Because when people started talking about humanism, they were really talking about Renaissance humanism. And now there have been all these different humanisms. And a lot of people today think of secular humanism. And Renaissance humanism was secular in a sense, but the people who pursued humanism were actually quite religious. They were all Catholic. And I'm just wondering if you could say a few words about the differences between secular and Renaissance humanism.
I mean, I guess secular humanism is a philosophical position, right?
Yes.
and it's a philosophical position that's defined against theism,
Yes.
and in opposition to theism, I guess you might say. So, often aligned with various forms of atheism or agnosticism. And so it has a particular philosophical viewpoint, we might say, a kind of a sort of developed form of atheism, perhaps.
Yes.
Whereas, Renaissance humanism isn't a philosophical position, right? So there's a sense in which you might describe it as a certain approach to things, a certain outlook, as we were saying, a certain attitude towards history, a certain attitude towards ancient history in particular, and the idea that we could learn things from that. But you could imagine a humanist in the Renaissance sense of the word, right? And it could be someone like Petrarch from the 14th century, it could be from the 15th century, it could be in Northern Europe in the 16th century. We're dealing with, a good, 250, 300 year period, right? Where we have what we would think of as humanist thinkers. And within that broad framework, you could imagine some who are very, very, many of them, as you say, would be sort of devout Christians during this period, the vast majority of them. But alongside that, you could imagine some who were drawn to Platonism, some drawn to Stoicism, some might have been sort of covert atheists drawn to Epicureanism, right, after the rediscovery of Lucretius and Diogenes Laertius. So there's a sense in which if you're a Renaissance humanist, you're not tied to any particular philosophical position. Your metaphysics could go in all sorts of different directions.
Right.
So,
yes. So secular humanism basically espouses a sort of like scientific and materialist worldview. It does have some things in common with Renaissance humanism, because both Renaissance humanists and secular humanists want to create a better world, and secular humanists want to do it through science and reason. But one of the really brilliant strategies of Petrarch is that he made the study of classical pagan texts safe for the Christian culture in which he was living. And the way that he did that was he said that, these secular pagan writings that can encourage a more virtuous society apply to this world. So it is the world of man, it's the earthly world, but that Christianity as a religion applies to the eternal salvation of the soul. So it's actually the timeless realm. And that was a very clever strategy of his to make the study of these ancient pagan writings safe for everyone in the Renaissance.
Yeah, and there's a story that can be told about how you get from the idea of humanism in the Renaissance to how you get to the more recent idea of secular humanism. So, picking up on a couple of things we've said already, the scholastic tradition is very closely tied to theology. A lot of the concerns are discussing questions about the nature of God, right? And then in the Renaissance, with Petrarch and with others drawing on these ideas from people like Cicero, there's a focus on, okay, how do we as human beings live? And you mentioned as well the role of civic humanism in the 15th century, and about how you run a city like Florence, which again are very sort of human-centered concerns rather than theological concerns. So there's a sense in which one of the things that's going on during the period of Renaissance humanism is an attempt to shift focus away from sort of otherworldly theological concerns to the concerns of human life, how we organize human communities, how we live our lives, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then you can see how over time that idea might develop into a kind of a philosophical position that wants to prioritize the human at the expense of the anything supernatural.
Right. Yes. Yes. So I'm working on this project called the Renaissance Program, and one of the goals of that is to take a more traditional look at philosophical ideas, so that we're not just learning about the thinkers of the past, but we're looking at what we could actually learn from them today, which is really, a traditional approach. But it's one that's actually often overlooked by the academic world. But that was the primary interest of the Renaissance humanists. They wanted to read these philosophical writers so that they could figure out, what possibly might be of value. And even Martin Kemp, who's the foremost living scholar on Leonardo da Vinci, said that if we couldn't learn something of value from Leonardo, he probably wouldn't be worth studying today. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you think are some of the ideas from Renaissance humanism that might be able to contribute to our world today, or might still possess value?
Yeah, the Renaissance humanists that I'm been most interested in, what they're doing is they're picking up these ideas from antiquity, very practical ideas about how we might live our lives, how to handle our emotions, how to deal with adversity. There's a long tradition amongst humanists of writing works of philosophical consolation. How do you cope with being exiled from your city? How do you cope with bereavement? How do you cope with the loss of a child? And so on and so forth. All of these sorts of questions, they're taking inspiration from various ancient texts they've read, but then they're trying to put those ideas into practice, and they're reflecting on, commenting on how these ideas work, whether they work or not. One really sort of striking story, very heartbreaking story in many ways. So Salutati, the follower of Petrarch, who's one of the chancellors of Florence, in his early life, he felt that he was a committed Stoic. He really embraced Stoic ideas, and he thought that they had a lot to teach him. And then one of his children died, and these Stoic ideas failed him. They were unable to offer him the consolation that he needed in that sort of time of crisis. And so in his grief, he kind of renounces Stoicism. He says, I don't think Stoicism works as a philosophy. It's failed to get me through this personal tragedy. And so what we see in a number of these texts are people really grappling with these ancient philosophical ideas and really putting them to the test. And so for people today that might be interested in Stoicism or any of these other ancient philosophies, what we see amongst the Renaissance humanists are people, is kind of an earlier generation trying to put these ideas into practice and really see if they work or not. And
Exactly.
writing some really interesting, beautiful texts in the process, recounting their experiences.
Yes. If I might add my own view on this as a kind of footnote to what you said, it's very interesting because you're very much involved in the world of modern Stoicism. And what I would say is that there's actually a kind of crisis in modern Stoicism, because we all know that if you do apply these Stoic ideas, they can help people lead, better and happier lives. But then the underlying crisis is like, how do we apply these ideas to the world in order to, could these ideas transform society in some way? And if you look at the Renaissance, that was really the first Stoic Renaissance. And what's happening with modern Stoicism is the second Stoic Renaissance. And I think that people who are interested in modern Stoicism could actually learn quite a bit from the Renaissance humanists in terms of how they applied Stoic ideas and Stoic-inspired ideas, say, like from Cicero, in terms of making a difference in society. And I personally think that one of the ways in which this could happen, one of the things that we could learn from the humanists is to revive something like the Studia Humanitatis, where in the humanities, there would once again be some kind of emphasis on, character formation and creating better people and a better society. Now, that's not part of the humanities today, but it was like a major aim of the original humanities. I think it was the ultimate aim. And one of the things that's really astonishing is that if you go into a humanities department today, 99% of the humanities professors actually have no idea at all that the original foundation or the original purpose of the humanities was to create better quality people. So I think that this is something that could be applied today. And there's actually a very interesting classical education movement in the United States that is growing substantially. And there's this one charter school system, for kids up through high school that has 30,000 students. And they are taking this kind of approach in terms of basically introducing the study of, what we would call virtue ethics into, the classroom. And by the time students get to high school, they're reading works by Cicero and Seneca and Plato and authors like that. And these charter schools are basically free. So if you take the curriculum of the charter school and you put it next to what's available in the public schools, it's just a compelling proposition that you should send your child to the charter school. So I think they have some problems because there's so much demand for it. I think they're having some difficulty finding, a lot of quality teachers. But the idea behind it, I think, is quite sound. And it seems to me that those ideas could actually be applied today, because whenever I look at our modern day political system, for example, I think about Petrarch's descriptions of how society is so corrupt in terms of not having quality leaders who have some kind of ethical foundation. So it seems to me that some of these original ideas from the Renaissance could be applied to improve the educational system, especially at the earlier grades, because when you get into college, people are very concerned about career opportunities and things like that. But to give students a better foundation, it sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's also something that you can present in a secular way too. It's not like religious education. So, for example, like you and I, we probably know many people who are atheists who subscribe to virtue ethics, because if you look at the cardinal virtues, it doesn't really matter whether you're a highly religious person or you're not a religious person. The whole idea of, practical wisdom, courage, self-control, and justice are just fundamental ideas that appeal to human nature. I don't think that there's anyone who would reject the value of those ideas.
I mean, that's one of the things that's quite rich about the ancient philosophical tradition. I mean, particularly in Stoicism, also in Aristotle, is that you've got a set of independent arguments about why it is certain virtues are important, or why virtue in general is something important. It's not dependent on some reference to a larger theological framework. And because they're offering these independent arguments, it's something that can appeal to people whether they have existing religious commitments or not. So
Exactly.
I think that it's open to everyone.
And of course, you can give a course in a secular university like how to be a Stoic or how to be a Platonist or how to be an Aristotelian. Probably it would be a little too ideological. But if you approached it from the standpoint of the study of ancient virtue ethics and how to become a more excellent person, and what theories were advanced in the past and what kinds of arguments were given, then that's something that would totally fit within an academic curriculum, with no difficulty whatsoever. So it's really been wonderful speaking with you, and I think we could go on forever. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to speak again when your book comes out. I just wanted to mention this program that we're putting on in Florence, Italy, which is a 5-day course, and it's limited to 20 people, called Creating the Best Possible World, the Energizing Ideas of the Italian Renaissance. And I think it's very unique because there are going to be lectures in the morning for 5 days, and then we're going to go out and look at the actual city of Florence, the architecture, the museums, the artwork, and see how these ideas were applied in the civic life of the Renaissance. It also includes a visit to the Medici Villa overlooking Florence and Fiesole, where Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola used to visit and meet there, along with Poliziano, who you mentioned, one of the foremost humanists. He spent quite a bit of time there, actually. And as you probably know, he was the tutor to Lorenzo de' Medici's children. He probably did some of his work up there. He did some writing up there as well. And he produced a translation of the Enchiridion of Epictetus. So we're going to go up there, and we have special access to go in the villa where these famous philosophers met. And then on the final day, there's going to be a symposium at Palazzo Rucellai, which was designed by Alberti. And there's a school now there, the International Studies Institute, and there's co-sponsoring this. And we're going to have a symposium, and it will cover philosophy in the Renaissance, including Stoicism and Platonism and other topics. So we would love to have you there. I know that you have prior commitments this year, but I'll post a link to this below. And it would be really wonderful to have you be part of this in the future. So.
Yeah, no, it sounds absolutely wonderful. If I could come this year, I would.
Yes. Yes. We decided to do it actually in November because there's a lot of tourism in Florence, and it can become extremely crowded in the summer. And it's very inexpensive, relatively speaking, to go there in November because the hotel costs are like half of what they are during the summer. So we wanted to keep the cost as low as possible. So we'll plan out further ahead and get you involved, and it'll be really wonderful. And hopefully we'll also have some other scholars speaking on Ficino and Stoicism there as well. So it's been really wonderful speaking with you, John, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you very much.